Welcome, everyone. My name is Jack Davis. I am your host and moderator for today's webinar on extreme heat resilience and real estate. We're glad you could join us today. This webinar is presented in part by the members of the Responsible Property Investing Council of ULI. The RPIC Council is focused on the incorporation of environmental, social, and governance considerations in real estate investment, planning, development, operations, etc. And this is the fifth webinar we presented in 2019, and we're again glad you could join us. The couple of quick housekeeping items. Everybody on the webinar is on mute, so we don't have any extraneous noise, and we will be looking forward to questions throughout the presentations today. To submit a question, you can use the Q&A feature on the software. Just submit that, and I will moderate or delegate questions to the panelists as appropriate. So we're ready to get started. Let me advance the slide here. If you haven't noticed, it's getting warmer. It's a hot summer, and it's been record-breaking across the nation and the world, actually, and it seems to be only getting worse. What you're seeing on your screen is a visualization of global climate data going back over 170 years. This data is presented by a website called Climate Stripes, and you can get this information for your own locality, but it shows the highlights of how information can be visualized and present this climate change data in a new and interesting way. But as we see the news articles around the world, things like heat waves in Europe, we had a heat wave in the East Coast that was record-setting. We have wildfires in Siberia, which is unusual to say the least, and a lot of issues that are really highlighting the need for better thinking around heat and heat mitigation, not only for just climate change reasons, but for urban heat island effects. As our society globalizes and urbanizes, we do have more and more people living in urban heat island types of areas, and it becomes more and more of an issue no matter what jurisdiction or climate you live in. Sorry, the slides are not advancing in this real. There we go. Sorry. So my name is Jack Davis. I'm the moderator. I'm with a company called Retech Advisors. We are glad to have a great panel of panelists today to help present today's discussion. Ladd Keith from the University of Arizona, Kizzy Charles Guzman from the City of New York, and Johnny Campbell from Sundance Square in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves as part of their presentations and give them more detail on their backgrounds and what they're working on, and really learn from their expertise in the work they're doing. The anchor point or the rationale for today's webinar is the release of a report from ULI called Scorched, Extreme Heat and Real Estate. This report is going to be available today and tomorrow, and you'll see press releases and information on the ULI website and the URL that you can see here. Very compelling information and case studies presented in this report. We recommend that everybody try and read this and review the information. There's background on the science and the impacts of heat and the impacts of health and wellness and economic productivity around heat issues, implications and opportunities for the real estate sector, whether it's a development, city planning, etc. Policy and the extreme heat policy landscape and policy ideas and examples, and then of course case studies and innovations that are happening around the country, some of which we'll hear about today. So again, I encourage everybody to download this report and review it and attend, if you can, the fall meeting events around this report too. And just so everybody knows, today's presentation is being recorded, and slides from today will also be available for your consumption. The key question that we're really trying to deal in today is what types of properties will be attractive in a growing heat environment. This quote comes from the report itself, from Edward Dixon, and it really frames what we want to talk about today is how do people want to spend their prop time, whether they live, work, or their leisure time from a real estate perspective? What strategies from city planning or design or development can we incorporate to make properties more comfortable, productive, and useful during a heat environment? For today's discussion, we're going to kind of start at the high level and go down to the macro. We're going to start from the research and move to the application. Ladd is going to talk about science, some of the background science around heat and what we're seeing. Kizzy is going to talk about the City of New York's efforts around heat island mitigation and heat programs. And then Johnny is going to talk about specific heat strategies at the renowned Sundance Square Plaza in Fort Worth, Texas, a place that is not unfamiliar with the issues around heat. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ladd and let him jump into the science and some of the background. Ladd?
Great, thank you so much, Jack. This is Ladd Keith. I'm an assistant professor in planning at the University of Arizona. And my research area is very much in line with today's webinar. So I look at the intersection of urban planning and climate science, specifically working with cities to respond and prepare for climate change to increase their sustainability and resilience. And traditionally, a lot of those impacts that cities have been focused on previously have been coastal sea level rise and urban flooding, but extreme heat is certainly becoming a more noticeable impact. And so the timing of this ULI report is perfect. So like Jack mentioned, I'll talk about some of the science behind the causes, some of the impacts, and then some of the ways that cities are addressing the risk. So extreme heat is a relevant and increasing climate risk. And everyone in the United States knows this. Just the last few weeks, there was a big heat wave with over 128 million people under excessive heat warnings. And that was for the July 2019 heat wave. And the map kind of shows the extent of that. So being from the Southwest, we've been dealing with extreme heat for quite a while, but this is obviously becoming more of a national and global concern for places that traditionally haven't dealt with extreme heat in this way. And it's not just an issue in the United States, but in 2019 alone, heat waves have been breaking records in places across the world. And just doing a quick search, there were heat waves in Australia, Japan, and India, Pakistan heat wave. And then of course, the European Union heat wave in June. So this is definitely a global issue that cities are grappling with right now. And so just to talk about some of the causes of extreme heat and the ways that we think about what's causing the increase, one of the big contributors is actually the urban heat island effect, which many people know about, but it's basically the idea that the built environment and urban activity result in higher temperatures in urban areas than their rural and natural surrounding lands. And this isn't something new in science. We actually observed this back in 1818. Luke Howard was the climatologist in London who discovered and documented the urban heat island effect. So that's 1818, and we're just now starting to really think about it because it's getting worse. So just thinking through some of the causes of the urban heat island effect, they're kind of listed to the left, and I won't go through all of them, but they vary by city, by geography, and by local climate. But things that you look at are land use and cover change. So larger urban areas tend to have a higher UHI than smaller urban areas. In larger cities like New York City and Hong Kong, definitely the urban form with the building height, density, and arrangement and the wind patterns will affect the UHI. Building materials is a big contributor, and so how much impervious surfaces there are. And then things like vegetation and humidity, so that could be urban forestry or water sources like ponds or rivers throughout urban areas can have impacts on that. And then other things too, like building equipment and waste heat emissions and also air pollution. So there's a whole range of complex things that kind of contribute to it. But the big idea is that large urban areas tend to have a higher UHI than smaller urban areas. And as you can see in the graphic, the arrangement of those places tends to do a lot with the impact of UHI. And so why we care about UHI is because in many cities, the difference between urban and rural areas can be on average about 10 degrees. But with the most extreme heat days, it can be as hot as 22 degrees. And so that's quite a big difference. And the big idea here is that we can use our understanding of UHI to reduce it and to increase our resilience to it. So we've kind of caused a lot of the UHI currently happening in large cities. And because we've caused it, we can also actively work to change that. And this map just shows a city that I've worked with, Avondale, Arizona. And you can see clearly the blue areas are kind of the agricultural open space natural lands, and the red areas are the clearly kind of built out areas of that city. And so similar things throughout the world when you look at UHI maps. And of course, the other big cause of extreme heat that we want to think about is climate change. And so we've had an increase in global average temperatures that have been very well documented. And those global average temperatures for specific locations are increasing the duration, frequency, and extremes of heat waves that are happening. And also important to mention that with climate change, there's a faster increase in nighttime temperatures, which have big implications for public health, because we need those cooler nighttime temperatures to let people rest and let their bodies recover. And so, in fact, just a few days ago, this July 2018 was named the hottest month ever recorded by a European Union climate agency. And so those records keep breaking. We certainly expect to see that continuing in the future. And the graphic over to the right-hand side here just shows that even a small increase in the average temperature can lead to quite a bit more extreme heat waves and more hot weather. So even those small incremental global averages we're seeing are what's leading to these extreme hot temperatures. And so looking at climate change projections, this is from the National Climate Assessment on the right-hand side for the United States. But the average annual temperature of the United States has already increased 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 3 decades. And we're projecting to see that increase from 3 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100, depending on emission reductions. And if you're not familiar with the different scenarios on the right-hand side, I think the important thing to look at is RCP 2.6 would be if we did the most possible to reduce emissions today, and RCP 8.5 is kind of the track that we're on. And currently we are on RCP 8.5, so we're looking at something closer to 12 degrees Fahrenheit increases. But important to note that we can avoid these worst case scenarios by drastically reducing greenhouse gas emissions today. So that's not, hope is not lost, but we need to act on this much more seriously than we currently are. And so there are quite a few impacts for extreme heat. And of course, these vary by location. And one thing to think about is locations that have been hot historically for a long time, like where I'm at in the Southwest, may have very different impacts than places like the temperate Northeast that maybe air conditioning isn't as widespread. So kind of as you look at these different impacts, just think of your own location and how these might be different for you. But obviously public health is a huge concern with extreme heat. Heat's actually the #1 cause of climate-related deaths in the United States. So not the more noticeable hurricanes or flooding or tornadoes, but actually heat is the #1 cause of death. But then also thinking about less about mortality and more about quality of life. So can children go out and play in playgrounds? Can people go down Main Street and do their shopping during the day? So those quality of life questions are really important too. There's economic impacts. A 2014 paper found that extreme heat can reduce productivity by up to 25%. And so we see that certainly in hotter locations in the Southwest. On hot days, retailers consistently report that they have less traffic than during cooler days. And so kind of thinking through what that might mean for your specific location. There's impacts for energy and water usage. And so it could be things as dramatic as blackouts when energy increases, but also just the idea that more air conditioning usage does lead to more greenhouse gas emissions, and that's something that we don't want to do. Infrastructure and urban systems are impacted, and the image to the right-hand side is kind of a famous example of Phoenix. When it gets too hot, the planes can't fly as well, and so sometimes they need to stay grounded. So kind of thinking through those infrastructure and urban systems. A less dramatic thing might be the subway system in New York on hot days, if it's safe to use, or light rail in places like Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona, where we've put those in place. Are people able to walk to those safely? Ecology and landscapes can be impacted. And so the USDA hardiness zones, so those are kind of the gardening maps and the agriculture maps, have been shifted quite a few times in the last few decades. And So kind of thinking through the appropriate plants and the appropriate urban landscapes that we use today might not be the ones that will thrive in 10 or 15 years or 20 years in the future. And then a big point is a lot of focus of sustainable development efforts that ULI has really been a champion on, like increased density, increasing walkability and bicycling, and just getting people outdoors into public spaces. A lot of those are very impacted by increasing heat. And so we want to make sure that we can design cities that are still sustainable and that deal with the heat as well. So heat can be a difficult thing to talk about, and it can be a difficult thing to get the public's attention on. As you can see in this picture, before the heat wave sometimes looks exactly like after the heat wave. And especially if you have air conditioning, the only thing you might notice would be a hotter walk to a car as you drive to work. So we want to think about as being an invisible climate risk sometimes compared to sea level rise, flooding, or wildfires. So that is one of the challenges of dealing with extreme heat because it is a little bit more of an invisible climate risk and it has previously gotten less press attention. It's also a compounding risk, and so deaths by extreme heat aren't often listed as deaths by extreme heat, but often people may have underlying health issues like heart conditions that extreme heat compounds that risk and leads to death. And so it can be really difficult for public health agencies to kind of tease those things out, and they're absolutely getting better at it, but that's historically been an area of weakness. It's also difficult to measure some of the other impacts like the economic impacts or the ecological impacts of extreme heat. Of course, the most vulnerable are at the highest risk, and so you can think of the elderly and children, but then also outdoor workers and agricultural workers are at high risk for extreme heat, and also those without air conditioning in a lot of locations. There's a lack of governance structure historically around heat, and so kind of comparing this with something like flood, with basically flood risk, we have a national flood system and FEMA maps, and there's flood insurance. And so lots of municipalities have floodplain management departments, and thinking about heat is not set up in the same way where there's generally not like a specific person tasked with dealing with extreme heat in a city. So kind of thinking through how those governance structures are evolving over time is important. Another challenge is that urban heat island maps and other data sources that we could use to make decisions on heat aren't widely available, specifically for medium and smaller size cities, although those are catching on in larger cities. And so kind of thinking through what that might mean for local decision making. And then of course, design and policy solutions are very context specific. And I think the Urban Land Institute report that's being released does a really good job of offering some of those solutions for different locations. And then finally, heat is the climate risk currently with the least resources available. And there was a great paper done a few years ago that had a survey of climate adaptation resources across the United States. And that paper found that only 4% of those resources available to planners and cities dealt specifically with extreme heat. And so that's increasing in the last couple of years, and this ULI report is part of that. But historically, it's been the climate risk with the least resources available. So kind of ending on a more positive note, though, there are opportunities and positive things happening with addressing extreme heat. So it's a rapidly growing area of interdisciplinary research. And so myself at the University of Arizona and our colleagues up at Arizona State University and many other universities are doing great research on this and kind of advancing knowledge on it. So we're getting an improved understanding of urban heat island mapping, doing things like ambient air temperature modeling, which you see on the right-hand side is some of my research team using some of those ambient air temperature measurements at a local school in Tucson, Arizona, and kind of seeing what kind of modifications we could make to make that outdoor space safer for children to play in during the hottest days of the year. There's more context-specific heat reduction strategies, and then public health agencies are really leading the way with prevention and response strategies, both before, during, and after extreme heat events. And then finally, like I mentioned, although heat governance hasn't really been a thing in the past, it's certainly evolving, and it's been kind of exciting to see how different cities are dealing with that. More opportunities include they're kind of thinking back through past before we had air conditioning even, and we had local traditional architecture in the Southwest, particularly that had historic examples of how to deal with heat before air conditioning. But then we also have a lot of new modern projects that are being built that are also heat adapted, and those are very nicely profiled in the ULI report that's coming out. and as well as emerging extreme heat mitigation and adaptation strategies for both the public and private sector. And so kind of the big idea here is that we can design heat adapted sites and plan cities to both reduce extreme heat and urban heat island, as well as continue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we want to make sure that we do both of those same things at the same time and don't chase maladaptive solutions where we might install a ton of air conditioning, but then that's still increasing emissions and contributing to global climate change. So we want to kind of think through all of those things together. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'm definitely looking forward to the discussion after the other presentations.
Thanks, Lad. That was great. Being based in the Southwest, I'm curious if there's some quick takeaways or things that you've learned that the rest of the country can learn. I know you said it's context and geographically specific, but are there some broader lessons that the Southwest can teach the rest of the country?
Absolutely, and I would say a lot of solutions I would not recommend for every place, just a blanket recommendation, but I think shade is one of those things that really works well in all situations. And so kind of thinking through how, whether it's on the site scale shade is being provided, or whether it's on the neighborhood or city scale, if you're doing things like providing cool corridors for people to walk in high traffic areas to the nodes of activity. So kind of thinking through planning shade really productively is a strategy that a lot of cities can use.
Great. Well, now we'll turn it to Kizzy at the City of New York and let her tell us about her work there. So, Kizzy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kizzy Charles Guzman, Deputy Director for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Trying to advance the slides. There we go. Our office applies the best available climate science and analysis to develop policies, programs, capital projects, and public engagements to address New York City's existing resiliency needs. We also lead collaboration across sectors and build capacity to enable city agencies and businesses, community organizations, and New Yorkers alike to take climate-smart adaptation measures. Even though we were officially created after Hurricane Sandy, our office focuses on a variety of climate hazards, and we are working on institutionalizing resiliency to these risks across city agencies. So everything from coastal storms, sea level rise, precipitation, and of course extreme temperatures, which are both for heat and cold snaps. According to the New York City Panel on Climate Change, by the 2050s, the number of days in New York City above 90 degrees will triple. And so we're facing a warmer and wetter future climate with more extreme events of all kinds. This is the New York City thermal imagery map, where blue areas are cooler, such as Central Park and Prospect Park, and the red areas are warmer, such as our airports and other highly dense places. We here can also see key drivers of heat impacts in New York, including traffic, infrastructure, and waste heat sources. So it's really clear that neighborhood and building characteristics exacerbate heat-related risks. Heat, as you heard, is the most fatal of all extreme weather events in New York City and in the US, and you can see that from the graph on the top right. While climate events like hurricanes do get a lot more media coverage, the reality is that extreme heat kills more New Yorkers than all other extreme weather events combined. Here I just provided a short list of a few events that resulted, as you can see, in a significant mortality over the last few years. In Japan, just last year, at least 80% of the deaths were among those that were 65 years old and above. But here, what I want to draw your attention to is the number of heat-related hospitalizations. So clearly, heat stroke and deaths aren't the only concern that governments and emergency managers are grappling with. And at the end of the day, each of these incidents was absolutely preventable. Oops. We also know that indoor temperatures can be up to 20 degrees higher than outdoor temperatures without air conditioner, and that New York City heat mortality rates are associated with poverty and poor housing quality. On average, we see each summer in New York that there are about 450 heat-related emergency department visits and 150 heat-related hospital admissions, 13 heat stroke deaths, and about 115 excess deaths from heat-related causes. So lack of access to air conditioning and heat-related mortality in high poverty neighborhoods go hand in hand. So heat risks vary by neighborhood. Here's again a map of the city. This is our heat vulnerability index, which was developed jointly by the Department of Health in collaboration with Columbia University researchers. It basically tells us there are 3.4 million people living in high heat vulnerability census tracts, and over 2 million New Yorkers also don't have access to air conditioning. So heat threatens New York City's livability, especially for vulnerable people. I do want to highlight that while some neighborhoods here in red, for example, are more at risk, they are vulnerable groups that are living in all of our neighborhoods, right? So there would be older adults, low-income people, those who have certain health conditions, etc. So over the years, the city has implemented many strategies to protect New Yorkers during heat waves, but more work needed to be done specifically to reduce disparities in vulnerability to climate change. So in 2017, we launched a comprehensive heat resiliency strategy that was aimed at reducing heat-related health impacts by lowering temperatures in those heat-vulnerable neighborhoods that I showed you. Also, the goal is to strengthen social networks and to improve quality of life for New Yorkers. So Cool Neighborhoods NYC is one of the case studies in the ULI Scorched report. So thank you for the shout out. And you can find our summary report online if you're interested in the variety of initiatives that we're undertaking. In the interest of time today, I'm only going to highlight 2 of them. But please note that this plan overall includes over $100 million of the city's budget that to be invested in high-risk areas over a 4-year period. And I also want to highlight that even though Cool Neighborhoods does provide funding for new initiatives, there are projects in there that do not require any new additional funding to protect the most vulnerable populations. So one key strategy in our plan is to invest over $100 million to plant street trees in historically underserved communities. Since we launched Cool Neighborhoods, our Parks Department has been planting trees strategically across city streets and small parks, and also doing some forest restoration targeting heat-vulnerable neighborhoods such as the South Bronx, Northern Manhattan, and Central Brooklyn. Of course, the benefits of greening strategies include mitigating the urban heat island effect and relieving heat stress by increasing shade and providing cool corridors, right? But we also see a lot of other environmental and social co-benefits of community greening efforts. Note in the photos the incredible shading potential of street trees. However, because it does take 100 years to grow a 100-year-old tree, we have to try other approaches to help cool our public realm. So the second initiative I'll highlight for you is our Cool Roofs program. As part of our Cool Neighborhood strategy, roof coatings in heat vulnerable areas are prioritized, and outreach to buildings is targeted there so that we can achieve clusters of light colored surfaces to reduce building heat gain, energy consumption, and waste heat from air conditioners. In 2018, the first full year since launching Cool Neighborhoods, 73% of cool roofs installed were in the 2 highest heat vulnerability tiers. This program is completely free for buildings that serve a nonprofit, affordable housing, or community or social service function, so we're focusing outreach there. Building owners can also get cool roofs for free if they request installation as part of a cluster of buildings in the same neighborhood. So the idea, again, is to concentrate as many roofs as possible in the geographies where we see the greatest public health and environmental impacts. Here you can get an idea of the impact of this work at the local level. This is public housing in Brooklyn. Before and after, all of the roofs were painted white. Buildings are responsible for 2/3 of the our city's greenhouse gas emissions. So the last plug I'll make about our work is that just this year, we enacted 2 local laws requiring all new buildings and those buildings that are undergoing major roof renovations to be covered with solar panels, green roofs, or some combination of the 2. The law is also expanding a previous policy that required cool roofs in new buildings because that old policy only applied to flat roofs. And so the new law also includes slopes, slope roofs, so all of them trying to reduce urban heat hazards. So this means that New York City may now have the world's most comprehensive sustainable roofing policy. But we anticipate that because of this policy, we can expect about 1 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 and up to 1 million additional gallons of stormwater managed every year. But we know that indoor temperatures with our air conditioning can be substantially higher than outdoors, so we need to do more, period. We need to do more to address indoor risk. A recent New York City study found that indoor temperatures in non-air conditioned homes remain high for days after a heat wave, even at night, just because of the building's thermal inertia, right? So its capacity to store heat. So here are some relevant headlines from the press, and I do want to highlight the case in Florida where the final death tally was actually 14 elderly residents. They died after Hurricane Irma knocked out the air conditioner to their South Florida nursing home, leaving the facility sweltering. However, you know, the hurricane wasn't the only reason for this tragedy. This happened because while the facility did have a backup generator, that generator was not feeding the air conditioning system. It wasn't connected to it. It wasn't able to do that. So in fact, in many instances, backup power systems do not address thermal comfort of building occupants at all. Air conditioners still very much considered a luxury and not a medical necessity in many circles. And in this case in Florida, the nursing home had initially alerted the County Emergency Operations Center that it had lost power, but when they were asked if they had any medical needs or emergencies, it did not request help for cooling. So there was a criminal investigation, and 12 of those 14 deaths were actually ruled homicides. The last thing I'll say about it is that the 245 employees in this nursing home were laid off because the license was revoked. Right, was suspended. So we're talking about nurses, doctors, occupational therapists, and even the environmental and laundry workers, the maintenance staff, all laid off. So you see the effect that poor climate preparedness can have on both our health, our lives, and our economy. And I'm sharing this anecdote because whereas it's appealing to think of sustainability or climate resiliency projects to be about increasing property values or providing beautiful luxury recreational spaces, in actuality, climate resiliency is about people's lives and the role that we can all play in actively addressing challenges that threaten the livability of our cities. So let's also remember that focusing on new construction won't get us to resiliency in places like New York City. Over 90% of the 1 million buildings that exist in New York will still be here in 2050, and their median age of residential buildings right now is 90 years old. So heat resiliency is going to have to entail a multi-layered approach to cover those buildings. We need strategies that provide thermal safety, that mitigate against thermal absorption, that facilitate ventilation and cooling during serious heat events. And in particular, as I mentioned, we need to focus on residential and adult care and supportive housing facilities. So in New York, we're really focused on regulatory avenues that will help address thermal comfort and safety in our existing building stock. And we're working to develop climate-focused design standards for our portfolio of buildings. One key takeaway that I can share with this group is that it is critical to design projects to withstand future climate conditions. For example, cooling and other HVAC systems should be provided for buildings to remain habitable, and the design should be based on the useful life of the components of the project. Because we thought that would be helpful to provide a framework for developers and agencies to understand how to do this, we released climate resiliency design guidelines, which are available online if you just Google those words. I am not going to go over each of these bullets, but many of these are recommendations from the guidelines that you can review on your own time. Basically, the guideline recommends that project designers consider two aspects of the relationship between their project and increasing heat. The way that the project increases or reduces the urban heat island effect, as well as the impact that rising average temperatures and the increased frequency of extreme heat days will have on the physical components or on the operations of the facility itself. And it's just as important to adjust a project designed to reduce its own contribution to the urban heat island effect. Just because the facility itself is cool doesn't mean that it did not increase the heat profile of the neighborhood where the facility is, right? So this would be the case if a project entails significant vegetation clearing, for example, or if it replaced permeable surfaces with a lot of heat trapping asphalt. So the bottom line is that to address heat risk, you have to be thoughtful about the materials in the built environment and their role in driving temperatures higher in neighborhood communities and increasing demands on cooling systems, which leads to sustainability challenges. So in our guidelines, we provide some guidance on how projects can reduce their contribution to ambient heat in the city, such as the strategies that are listed on this slide. There are many useful resources that may be of use to this group, aside from the report that's being released today, and here's a handful of them, all of which you can access freely online. Please note that there's another Urban Land Institute report that was focused here in New York City. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware that these exist. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I thank you, Alive, for highlighting our work in the Scorched report.
Thank you, Kizzy. A follow-up question. One of the challenges that Ladd highlighted was what he called heat governance. And I'm curious how New York, or how your work deals with the governance of these issues, because I'd imagine it deals with different agencies as well as the private sector and the real estate developers as well. How do you navigate that, what he calls the governance side of this issue?
Well, I think I would say, to be funny, that we navigated painfully. But no, we convene interagency and multi-sectoral working groups all of the time in order to really mine the best available science and strategies from all over the place, for all places, and trying to understand where the agencies are at, right, in terms of implementation or their funding, what their concerns are, how we can help advance their mission, right, in the climate changing world. So we don't develop these plans in a vacuum. Of course, we work closely with the city council and with our state and federal partners as well to really understand what are strategies that work, what is the potential for effectiveness for each of the strategies, and it's a long negotiation process for sure. The items that can be legislated, we do, because we are excited to make sure that an initiative doesn't die just with an administration change, right? If we believe in the challenges, then we believe in the solutions that can help solve them, and so we want to legislate that as much as possible.
Thank you.
No problem.
Well, now I'll turn our attention south to Texas and introduce Johnny from Sundance Square, one of my favorite places to have a cold beer on a hot day. Johnny, take it away. Johnny, make sure we can hear you. Are you on mute?
Okay, I'm here. Sorry, wrong button. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping to take a few minutes today and maybe round out what we've seen so far and show, hopefully, how real estate programming can merge in coincidence, what I think is a good coincidence with some of the ideals and goals we've heard so far. I'm Johnny Campbell. I'm president of Sundance Square Management, and Sundance Square is by way of background, a 35 square block private redevelopment in downtown Fort Worth. It was intended to be a revitalization catalyst for the city, and I'm going to zero in a little bit today on the plaza, the central plaza that appears as our latest development. The Sundance Square started in the mid-'70s, but it wasn't until 2013 that we developed a central plaza, though it had been on our master plan from the very beginning. If you look at the slide or the picture in the upper left corner, you can see two of those heat-trapping asphalt parking lots that Kizzy mentioned just a moment ago. And if you look near the center of the screen, you can see a building with a red roof, a smaller building that has a mural just to orient yourself so that when you look at the bottom right of the screen, you can see what is now the Sundance Square Plaza, and that mural that you see on the left side of that lower right-hand photograph is the same building. What had happened to us over the years is we had been programming in those asphalt parking lots as though it were a plaza of sorts. And when we programmed there, we began to learn over the years that we could turn this great space, location, I should say, into an attraction that would be the centerpiece of the Sundance Square development. And what you're looking at today, or the photograph that you're looking at now, is 2011, when we had the Super Bowl in North Texas. And those of you that remember that, it was the Green Bay Packers and the Pittsburgh Steelers, and there was an apocalyptic snowstorm on that same week. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but this photo was taken just the day before the storm rolled in. But what we normally deal with in Fort Worth, Texas is not, we do get winters, and we have to be aware of those, but we also have serious heat concerns. And so as we began to think about the development of what would be the plaza, you're again now looking at a graphic that shows straight overhead those two asphalt parking lots, but the bookend buildings that you see on each end, along with the new surfaces, and you can see the colors and the different material changes that we were considering at the time, was a way to take those two parking lots and turn them into a plaza or a piazza, something you see all around the world, bookended by these two buildings, in a way that would create a great human space. And I say here that we started with the idea of creating a human space because we obviously were looking at it in terms of programming and attracting people to the downtown. But immediately as our discussions began, and we had our whole team there, you'll see this in the report that is being released, but David M. Schwartz Architects out of Washington, D.C. is our master plan architect for all of Sundance, and Michael Ferguson Associates out of Alexandria, Virginia, was the landscape architect on this particular project, the plaza. And we immediately moved from the question of how do we attract people to how do we create a space in which people will want to be, a space where people will find themselves comfortable and will also be sort of that centerpiece. And so the conversation quickly went to how do we handle heat? How do we handle these Texas summers? And so we started by looking at the buildings and studying shade coverage, studying how these new buildings that we were adding, you can see the two bookend buildings here with that mural building, and you can see what the shade study said would be the shade coverage on March the 21st at 2 p.m. And then next you can see how March the 21st at 5 p.m. would look. And we actually did these studies for all seasons, all throughout the day, so that we could understand exactly what we could expect out of the space. You'll notice as you look at this one, this is oriented correctly, so north is up, south is down, west is to east, or I'm sorry, west is to the left, and east is to the right. And you can see that as the sun sets to the west, the shade progresses from left to right across the plaza. So we began to understand that we were going to need to work with something on the east side that would create shade in the afternoon. Having said that, I'm going to go back one slide. We also studied how all of the buildings and the features would measure up in terms of shade coverage in the winter, the fall, the spring, and the summer, in the morning and in the afternoons. And without plowing through the whole table, I'll just draw your attention to the center column where it says daily afternoon average. And if you look at the very bottom number, that's the summer. In the daily afternoon, 8,640 square feet would be under shade pre-development. And on the top chart, you can see that that was increased to 26,860 square feet under shade after the development. And so you can see that we were looking specifically at summer and trying to learn how we might create that space in a way that would also make it comfortable. We also added a bunch of features. One dirty little secret about programming is that it's much easier to program a space that is already attracting people than it is to take a space that isn't attracting people and program it into a great space. And so we said we wanted to create a feature-rich plaza that had things to see, and if we were lucky, we would create features that would also create a good human scale and a good place for people to be. And so in the photograph you're looking at now, we've got the things that we termed back in those days our magic umbrellas. On the left, you see them closed in a hard shell, which allows them to stay closed when we are in the wintertime, or if we've got events or things happening that require a little more headroom. And then as the day progresses or as the heat comes along, these will open. And hopefully I can get this to go. I've got a 1-minute video, and I'm going to talk through it as I've just started, just to show how the east side of that plaza really works with these umbrellas. You can see the morning sun casting over from the building now, and you can see these umbrellas opening. It takes them about 1 minute to open. Each of the umbrellas are 40 foot by 40 foot in length and width, and they're 35 feet tall. So they cast a 6,400 square foot shadow on the east side of that plaza. So when the west sun comes across, you can see how that might actually affect the plaza and its operation during that time. And this is one of those coincidences where I say that you can see the color of the umbrellas. They do not, they don't have a heat gain problem. They create a great shade area that people can be under. They also are very entertaining. Usually we'll exercise these once or twice during the day, and people will video these umbrellas opening and closing as we exercise them and operate them. You can also kind of tell as you look down at that shade that's being cast. The morning shade, as it moves back on the building, the shade progresses further under the umbrellas, as you might expect. So these have turned out to be not only a great heat gain protection, but truly an attraction for Sundance. And so if I can make it advance, it might make me, whoops. We also have a couple of other features. We've got a pavilion building there that's a respite, and the arrow points there, and this building is a respite for people to come in and take cover. You can also see a fountain in front of that building, and one of our newest owner influences has really dressed it up with lots of greenery and extra shade cover. It turns out that the landscaping is one of the secrets about taking the plaza, although it's an event space, and making it feel softer and cooler. We also have dancing fountains on the west side of the plaza. These, to me, have created a great space. Obviously, water's a great way to transmit psychologically a cooler space, but also you can see the kids are playing in the fountain. It's an actual cool space. And in the bottom right-hand corner photograph, I'll just point this out. This is the fountains turned off. And this is a movie night in a summer movie. In fact, it was last Thursday here in Texas. You can check that temperature. It was very hot. But those fountains, when the water drains back into the reservoir, the ground level is cool and creates a great space for people to sit in. You can see folks actually sitting on the ground there. We've also created some smaller spaces like the one the arrow is pointing to now that are small contemplative spaces that have shade from both sides, but are places for people to sit. There's a fountain here and vines that grow up and across those wires as the summer progresses and creates some natural shade. And then on the south side of the plaza were those alleys of trees that you probably remember from the graphic. And here are a couple of photos that show what they do to the sidewalks and the south edge of the plaza to create another great shaded space. This walkway you see on the left is a very popular walkway for people to move through just because of the shade. And so I hope what I've demonstrated here is a thought process that started with programming and how we'll use a space to activate the area and all of the blocks we have around, but ended up quickly into a parallel course of creating a way to stop maybe some of the heat sink and the grow up of heat around. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jack and go on to Q&A.
Thanks, Johnny. We're getting a lot of questions about your umbrellas. I want to ask you about those in a second. But I wanted, in our previous conversation, you mentioned some learning that you had about the material selection of the plaza, bricks versus concrete versus broken up granite, et cetera, and the way it behaved with the heat. Can you share that?
I can. You know, there's a long history of a red brick paver in Fort Worth. It goes way back 100 years. And so we knew we had to find a way to deal with the red bricks, but also have a way to keep those, I'm going to say the red ground surface, and keep those cool. We learned right away that when you use the full-size brick or turn them on their edge, some of those are herringbone patterns, the thickness of the brick between top to bottom makes it much harder during the day for the sun to heat it. And if you notice the shade structures and the way the shade moved, we don't keep shade anywhere at any one time for a long period. And then we use light-colored granite for all of our accents, so it's reflective. We also have selected lots of wood for the furniture. I know that's a maintenance question for a lot of folks, but we found a wood called ipe that is on most of our benches, and that wood does not pick up heat, and it really helps to keep it cool.
Thank you. And we did get a question about the manufacturer, cost, and lifespan of those umbrellas.
The manufacturer is a company called SL Rausch. They're in Germany. I will tell you, I'm not aware of these umbrellas anywhere else in the U.S. at the moment. There may be some by now. We put these in 2013. The four umbrellas, and you can see that they are sort of mechanical marvels. The four umbrellas at that time were about $2.5 million for those four, but they're really large umbrellas. The rain goes down the inside of the umbrellas. There's no drip line around them. As for the life of the umbrellas, that one we're still sort of learning. These are used all over the Middle East, and if you look at the SL Rausch websites, you'll see photographs of these in mosques and courtyards all over the Middle East, and they've been around a long time. I will tell you, we know the sun doesn't bother them. We haven't really tested them with the North Texas hail yet.
So just a reminder to all our attendees today, if you have questions, please submit them on the Q&A tab on the webinar, and happy to address as many as we can before we close out. Johnny, another question for you. What's the vintage of the low-rise buildings on the periphery of the plaza? I know Sundance goes back quite a ways in some of the buildings there.
You know, the one with the mural is a 1910 building. And there was another one that was you could just see the tip of it in one of the graphics, an 1889 Romanesque revival building that was added to one of the new buildings. But the heyday of Fort Worth's architecture was really the very early 1900s in the Deco period. And so if you saw that Castle Hall building that, sort of looked like a castle, that's a 1902. The buildings that are bookending the plaza are new. We built both of those in 2013, but we built them in a palette and a style that we believe is complementary to the historic buildings. But overall, there are 44 buildings that Sundance Square owns, and 7 of them are under 50 years old. The rest are historic.
I have another question that I'll open up to all our panelists about white roofs. And anybody have any experiences on maintenance of white roofs, cleaning white roofs, and keeping the umbrellas clean and Sundance, and just the general maintenance and operations of these cool roof and shade technologies. I'll open it to anybody.
Well, I'll give one quick one. You probably noticed our roofs in Sundance are all pretty meticulously kept on those lower buildings because it's surrounded on the periphery by tall buildings. And so we want to be able to look down on something nice. And all of our roofs are light colored. They may move from tan to gray to white. And, you know, we've found that the new membrane style roofs are really not that difficult to keep clean. If the drains are clean and you've got water available, you can keep the roofs clean. The lower they are in the traffic areas, the more sooty they tend to become.
And this is Kizzy. I will just add that in New York, one of the white roofs are recoated, and we recommend that they're recoated after 5 years, right? And so the maintenance in between is done as it normally would, right, by the private building owner or by our city agencies. We do offer a free recoating after if the last coating was more than 5 years ago. And again, the cost is super low. It's like 50 cents to $1 per square foot, depending on the product that is used. But it really does increase the longevity of the roof.
Yeah, this is Lad. I would just add that white roofs are one of those examples where you don't want to recommend a silver bullet for every location. So there's been some studies that showed if too many roofs were painted white in southwestern cities, they would reflect the light, the heat back up into the atmosphere at just enough level to potentially disrupt cloud formation and decrease rainfall that we need. And so again, that would have to be quite a few white roofs, but you could imagine like a mandatory code that that forces all buildings to have white roofs could have some kind of regional impact like that. So I think Johnny was right. It's not just white roofs, but it might be light colored roofs and kind of thinking through those different building materials. So.
We're also getting several questions about other strategies for roofs, such as solar on rooftops and green roofs with vegetation. Lad or anybody, do you have experience with the research on those as mitigation strategies in addition to the other benefits they bring?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So again, it's location specific. So green roofs are great in environments that have the rainfall to support them. In the Southwest, green roofs don't work very well because they tend to kind of absorb as much heat as a normal roof would unless you water them a lot. And then there's kind of those really difficult interactions between how much water do you want to use versus the savings that you're getting from reducing heat. So I think again, it's a mixture of different things that are context specific. So, but solar on roofs is great because at the very least, the heat is being, transformed into energy through the solar panels, and it's providing some kind of shading to the building, which will lower the energy costs to keep the building cool. So I think kind of looking at all of those as a portfolio of strategies is important.
Thank you. Any closing comments? I think we're about at our time from the panelists that they'd like to send the audience away with. Any words of wisdom? Well, I'll offer one parting thought, and it's tapping a little bit to what, Lad, you were saying is, in addition to addressing and mitigating the issues of heat, we always need to continue to work to make the buildings energy efficient because there's a feedback loop. And the more we can reduce air conditioning, waste heat, and other sources of waste heat in our cities, it actually is a way to make the buildings more efficient, reduce costs, increase NOI, but also it's a win-win because it reduces the heat that's being displaced into our cities. So just a reminder that there are multiple layers to each of these questions, and we want to try to find win-win solutions wherever possible. With that, I want to thank our panelists, Lad, Kizzy, and Johnny, very informative, and encourage everybody on the webinar today to go and download the ULI report and attend the ULI fall meeting and learn more and talk with each other about solutions. And we thank you for your time today. Goodbye.